An old pond. A frog jumps in. The sound of water. This is a haiku composed in 1686 by Matsuo Basho. Such a simple, prosaic observation, only 17 syllables long in Japanese. As Nobel Literature Laureate Octavio Paz says, "The pond, the frogs jumping, the sound of water. Nothing is less poetic. Common words and an insignificant fact." In this small, constrictive form, there's barely enough room to get a concrete idea across, hardly any space for detail or decadence. Yet, that first line, read in Japanese as furoike ya, touches something deep in many people's hearts. Paz himself went on to write that this haiku, this poem that is barely a poem, contains a world of resonances, echoes, and correspondences. The pond, the frog, the sound of water seem to speak to each other, and to you. Out of these simple statements comes an expansive and illuminating understanding. It can be hard to see. I think to many, the haiku is more of a meme than a legitimate form of expression. But there's a reason it's so well known, so beloved. What Paz describes, what Matsuo Basho captures so succinctly in so few words, is truth. The kind of truth that can only be told concisely. To really understand the beauty of haiku, this elusive, bizarre form of art so difficult for us to understand in the West, I think it best we look to the master. Though the details of his early life are unclear, we can gather that Matsuo Basho was born Matsuo Kinsaku in 1644 in the Iga province of Japan, one of 6 children in a minor samurai family. Later, he took the pen name Basho. And I love that because it translates to banana tree, which he chose to honor the tree outside his hut that his disciples gifted him. He even wrote a poem about it. A night listening to the rain leaking into the tub, the banana plant blown by the gust. A glimpse of how poetry wound its way through his life. But Basho's road to the art began far earlier than that. At just 8 years old, he entered the service of a samurai lord, becoming a page to the lord's son, Todo Yoshitada, known by the pen name Sengin. Lord Sengin was only 2 years older than Basho, and the boys got along well, more like friends or brothers than lord and servant. They studied poetry under the same master and shared a love for haikai no renga, a form of collaborative linked verse in which participants would spontaneously compose a verse in response to the one that came before. The opening stanza was called a hoku and always involved a 5-7-5 mora format, mora being a Japanese sound unit similar to an English syllable. The standalone haiku, as it later became known, evolved from this opening stanza of the haikai no renga form. In 1665, Basho, Sengin, and some other acquaintances composed a 100-versed haikai no renga together in honor of the 13-year death anniversary of their poetry master's master. Just 1 year later, Lord Sengin suddenly died at the age of 25. This undoubtedly came as a shock to Basho. His friend and companion throughout life had gone. His path had frayed. He gave up his aspirations as a samurai, left Iga, and began on a new path that would lead him to become the master poet we know now. His time with Lord Sengin left a deep impression on him. 20 years later, he went back to Iga in the spring. As he stood under the cherry trees where the two of them had worked and played together in their youth, the following poem came to mind. Oh, many, many things are brought to mind by cherry blossoms. Basho was one of the earliest and greatest of the Japanese haikuists, perhaps even the greatest poet of the entire Edo period. His poems are still used as a model by haikuists today. You already heard one from him, Furoike ya, an old pond. But in the century after Basho, another master emerged, Yosa Buson, who made Basho a personal idol, traveling to the same places Basho had and using the same poems of Basho's disciples as models for his pupils. One well-known haiku he wrote reads, "The winter wind flings pebbles at the temple bell. A couple generations after Buson, another master, Kobayashi Isa, wrote his own distinctive haiku, notable for their empathetic attentiveness toward the small creatures of the world. O snail, ever so slowly climb Mount Fuji. In the 19th century, a fourth master poet, Masuoka Shiki, popularized the term haiku as the modern name of the independent 575 hokku-like poem. Flutteringly, floating in the breeze, a single butterfly. So, we've seen what haiku looks like at this point, the work of the masters themselves. We know where it comes from, but it doesn't mean we know what it is. The answer to that question is actually surprisingly hard to piece together. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, haiku is an unrhymed poetic form consisting of 17 syllables arranged in 3 lines of 5, 7, and 5 syllables respectively. American poet Harold G. Henderson adds on to these conditions, prescribing that a haiku must contain nature, must refer to a specific event, not a generalization, and must be set in the present. Still others say that a haiku should contain a season word, a kigo, and a cutting word, a kireji. A season word is a word with Japanese seasonal connotations that contribute to the setting and atmosphere of the poem. For example, in Furuike ya, the frog could be read as a seasonal symbol implying springtime. A cutting word is a trickier concept to explain. It's like a caesura or verbal punctuation of sorts, which divides the haiku into 2 parts and prompts the reader to reflect on the relationship between the juxtaposed elements. For example, in Furuike ya, the ya, an untranslatable utterance of appreciation, interest, or awe, forms a division between the venerable stillness of the pond and the jump of the frog that broke the quiet. Its function is often replaced by a dash in English. Another major consideration for haiku is its auditory quality. A certain euphony to the roll of the vowels is important in the effect of the poem. An old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. Season word, cutting word, nature, immediacy, specificity, auditory considerations. It seems like 3 lines and 17 syllables is hardly enough to contain all these prescriptions. Fortunately, I don't really think it's any of these features which make a haiku. As Japanese writer Kaneko Toda writes, everything that can be written down about haiku fails to explain its true nature. We say that haiku has 3 lines, yet in Japan, they're traditionally written in 1 line. American poet Ezra Pound famously wrote In a Station of the Metro a haiku in 2 lines, and Bashio himself has been known to write Furuike ya in 4. We say that a haiku has 17 syllables arranged in a pattern of 5-7-5, yet the English syllable and Japanese mora are different. For example, the word haiku has 2 syllables in English, but 3 mora, haiku, in Japanese. About 12 English syllables approximate the duration of 17 Japanese moras. Even within Japanese, poets have often disposed with the mora guidelines completely. Haiku can be vastly different from one another. It's a form, not a template. It is not perfectly distinct. But there is something at the heart, something they all share. They are all short. Bashio once traveled to see the famous pine of Shiogoshi. Experiencing the view of the pine and the entire beauty of the place, he recalled a poem by the 12th century poet Saigyo. Inviting the wind to carry salt waves of the sea, the pine tree of Shiogoshi trickles all night long, shiny drops of moonlight. Bashio believed that Saigyo's poem on the pine was so clear, so succinct, so perfect that, in his own words, should anyone dare to write another poem on this pine tree, it would be like trying to add a 6th finger to his hand. In a few lines, Saigyo conveyed everything materially, sensorially, and emotionally important about the pine. There was nothing more to say. I think that the core identity, the fundamental feature of haiku, is the same thing that Basho admired about Saigyo's poem: absolute conciseness. A haiku is so unforgivingly, brutally short because beauty and value can come out of restriction. Not the kind of restriction that keeps you from thinking outside the box, not the kind that involves cramping and squashing an expansive idea into a box too small for it so that it loses all its shape, but the kind that involves having a box so small that only the most essential, most valuable, most basic things can fit into it. A box that necessitates honing your rough idea to a fine, hard, lustrous stone. Kaneko Tota likens a haiku to a diamond cut to a precise pattern, maximizing the transmission of white light. In his words, it is the crystallization under pressure from restricted form and the internal nature of the crystals so created that together constitute the unique quality of haiku. It may, perhaps, seem somewhat precious to symbolize in the image of a crystal that essential quality of the world's shortest poetic form, but the fact remains that the haiku does produce a feeling of intensely hard substance. Basho was a great haikuist because he required his poems to be crystalline, so perfectly hard that they can neither lose nor gain another word. Basho's student, Kikaku, writes about his teacher: now in his old age, his poetic style has become so hard and dry that his poems naturally remind us of the best of Saigyo's works. Hard and dry are not the usual compliments I would expect for a poem. I would think that a poem should be fluid, graceful, romantic, and, well, poetic. Yet Kikaku did mean this as a compliment. In the same breath, he compares Basho to Du Fu, a deified figure long before their time, frequently said to be the greatest Chinese poet. Anyone can write a short poem. Brevity on its own is not conciseness. It doesn't produce a crystalline structure. Conciseness is about brevity without compromise, without losing a single part of the original illumination that prompted the writing of the poem. A poet needs to choose their few precious words with extreme deliberation so that an intellectual and emotional image which 1,000 words couldn't express is evoked in their 17 syllables, so that a whole scene, a deep understanding, is made complete by their tiny poem. This is the process of pressure which creates a diamond. I mentioned the poem In a Station of the Metro by Ezra Pound earlier. Here's what he had to say about the process of writing that strange little haiku. I wrote a 30-line poem and destroyed it because it was what we call work of second intensity. 6 months later, I wrote a poem half that length. A year later, I wrote the following hokku-like sentence: the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet, black bough. And that is the poem In a Station of the Metro in its entirety. The Japanese poet Yone Noguchi writes that a haiku is like a tiny star carrying the whole sky at its back. As the Chinese saying goes, from one leaf we know the whole autumn. This is the crystallization and hardness that Tota and Kikaku mean. The small handful of words within a haiku need to form the star through which we know the whole sky, the leaf through which we know the whole autumn, the leap of a frog that sends ripples over the surface of an entire pond. But how do you find such a star? How do you choose the words? Well, that is beyond my ability to describe. That is the eternally elusive part. Basho says, go to the pine if you want to learn about the pine, or to the bamboo if you want to learn about the bamboo. Your poetry issues when you have plunged deep enough into the object to see something like a hidden glimmering there. A good haiku comes from someone who has thought deeply, plunged deeply, crossed out, erased, and rewritten until they discovered a diamond of pure, compressed understanding. The concise 17 sound units, the shortcut to illumination. American poet Robert Epstein writes, "The pond is old, even ancient, as some have translated the Japanese. An ordinary amphibian jumps into that old pond and the sound awakens in the poet and reader a truth that transcends time, culture, nationality, and religious tradition. An instantaneous bond is formed among pond, frog, poet, and reader, which is nothing less than extraordinary. We are family, we are friends, forevermore. This is why I love haiku and why I will continue to read and write until I draw my last breath. In the later part of his life, Bashio went on a series of extensive travels, producing some of his best works in the last 8 years. In 1694, while on a journey to his birthplace, he became sick from a stomach illness. His last poem was recorded by his disciple Kikaku. Sick on a journey, my dreams run about, over a withered field. Upon reciting it, he asked his disciples whether or not a small grammatical change might make the poem better. As Kikaku writes, his strong attachment to his art and his determination to dedicate himself to poetry moved everyone to deep sorrow. Bashio's disciples buried him in his chosen place, and Kikaku placed the following poem below his memorial tablet. A hat to cover the body of our master, withered silver grass. A hard loss for the world of poetry, but there's no need to feel sad for Bashio. That was what he wanted to do. Live and die immersed in the poetry, a life distilled into the simplicity of a single crystalline form. The poet Katsushika Hokusai, better known as the painter of the Great Wave off Kanagawa, expressed this sentiment perhaps better than anyone else, in the form of his very own haiku. I write, erase, rewrite, erase again, and then a poppy blooms. Speaking of conciseness, the material world can sort of get in the way of this whole process, can't it? The stress of the daily grind can make it difficult to appreciate the simple beauty of the world you occupy, much less manifest it into your art. There are a million simple ways to relieve this burden, give yourself a better chance at finding the beauty, crystallizing your vision of it. But one method we love here is to just think less about money. I mean, I'm just a machine. I don't have to worry all that much about these things. But the humans who run this show? Madness. Always horrified about the possibility of the bank account drying up, especially in this new world of horrifically inflated gas prices and foodstuffs. Every penny you can save brings you that much closer to a stable, sane, and ultimately creative life. To that end, our humans have been loving the app Upside. In fact, just before finishing this script, our director had to fill up his tank at a gas station. Normally that would have cost about $3.17 per gallon, but with Upside he was able to get back 36 cents for every gallon, bringing it all the way down to just $2.81 per. And that's just one of the ways our team has been taking the edge off with Upside. You can also use it for other expenses, like restaurants and groceries. It's a pretty simple concept. Upside partners up with local businesses, finds which ones could use your patronage, and who can afford to give you a little cash back. All you have to do is download the app, claim an offer, check in, and finish the purchase with your card like you normally would. That's it. And then cash just magically appears in your account. Like actual cash. Cash that you can claim through PayPal or have transferred directly to your bank account. It's an amazing way to bring down the cost of living while helping local businesses to drive more sales and stay competitive. And it really couldn't be much easier. If you want to worry less about how much money is going to be left in your wallet at the end of the month, I definitely recommend giving Upside a try. It's totally free. They don't even sell your information. Literally all Upside. To get started, all you have to do is download the free Upside app. Then once you're in, you can use our promo code TALEFoundry, that's TALEFoundry all one word, to get an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas. And that's in addition to the cashback you'd normally get from Upside, so it should be quite a lot altogether. And all at literally no cost to you. A special thanks to Upside for sponsoring this video and taking the edge off living. Fear not the eraser. As always, keep making stuff up, but also don't be afraid to pare it back down as well. Sometimes fewer words hold more truth. Until next time, thanks for watching. Bye!